No.
Yes, we are live.
All right. So joining me today is David Newman. He is our newest global security analyst, and we're going to talk a little bit about the phenomenon of Islamic State and the broader phenomena of jihadism in West Africa and littoral West Africa. So, David, set the scene for us. What is the current situation with Islamic State and Salafi jihadism in West Africa?
Yeah, sure. To put it bluntly, Charlie, it's not looking good. Uh, and I think it's important here to note that when we're talking about this sort of Salafi jihadist movement, and specifically emanating from the Sahel and into West Africa, it's also including, of course, Al Qaeda affiliates, local armed Islamist militant groups, a various and very complex network of relationships there too. But when it comes to us sort of observing this trend, we're looking at specific hotspots, and what we're seeing, especially this year, is a significant deterioration in security in Mali, in Burkina Faso. We are still seeing attacks, of course, in Niger, and I would say, in particular, that tri-border region between Mali, Burkina, and Niger is particularly turbulent. And I should note that, as we talk about this deteriorating security with Mali, it's also correlating with this trend of Mali's growing isolation and alienation from the international community. This is happening at the regional level with its neighbors. It's happening at sort of the broader international level when it comes to its relationships with MINUSMA, the UN peacekeeping mission there. Also, the EU, they suspended some of their training missions there earlier this year. And so, as we're seeing this security situation deteriorate, especially in Mali, also in Burkina Faso, we're seeing this growing jihadist threat that is beginning to threaten directly some of these littoral West African states. And here I'm also looking very specifically at states that are lining the Gulf of Guinea recently. And really what this kind of encroachment looks like, it's not necessarily incredibly well-developed inroads that, where these groups have established operational bases, but they're especially taking the form of these cross-border attacks. And we're seeing a very recent and high spike in these attacks in Togo. We've seen an increase in attacks in Benin. Cote d'Ivoire has seen some in the last year. And then recently, Ghana, which hasn't actually experienced, a full-on cross-border attack, but they are receiving a lot of spillover in the form of refugees coming from Burkina Faso. And recently, these refugees crossed the Ghanaian border and were pursued by militants. And as it turns out, the Ghanaian border security wasn't armed at the time, or excuse me, their immigration officers were not armed at the time, fled the scene. And so then you had this contingent of militants, more or less, coming across the border into Ghanaian territory. So this threat is elevated at this time. But even beyond that specific pocket, Mali and Burkina Faso, and especially as we talk about the Islamic State, you have ISGS in Mali and Burkina Faso, and they're particularly active in that tri-border region. But we also have the Islamic State West Africa province that has taken the lead, for lack of a better term, in waging this insurgency, and that was in northeast Nigeria. But over the last year, we are seeing this expansion, this geographic expansion, that has started out to be something very gradual, where they start to attack locations that are geographically further away from their operational bases in the Northeast, where the Nigerian military is launching their offensives. And, this has recently culminated in this prison break in Kuje, or Kuje prison is located in Abuja, in the capital. And so now we're seeing this this elevated threat in Nigeria as well. And that, I mean, for Nigeria, that comes amid myriad threats to their security, whether it's separatists in the southeast, bandit groups active in the northwest, not to mention a resurgent Ansaru, the organization that has traditionally been affiliated with Al Qaeda, also has a sort of a working relationship. That's another question I'm exploring right now, is to what extent they work with JNIM, which is one of the most powerful and quickly strengthening groups in the region. So that's kind of the broad strokes. That's setting the scene of what this is looking like right now. And the result right now is we're seeing this elevated threat to these West African states, the coastal ones that at least previously have been far less affected by the jihadist expansion across the Sahel, but now more directly so.
Yep. And that kind of dovetails with what I've seen in the broader jihadist landscape from the Middle East and North Africa side of the equation, particularly as Islamic State's fortunes have kind of declined in Iraq and Syria to an extent or another. At least their current position in Syria is rather uncertain, given that they've suffered a lot of tactical losses recently. There was a U.S. drone strike that killed an Islamic State leader in Syria a few weeks ago. There have been they continue to operate sleeper cells in Syria and Iraq, and they continue to conduct attacks, but they're not necessarily having it's unclear if they have good strategic fortunes in that region. And what we've seen in the last few weeks, particularly on the propaganda side, or last few months anyway, on the propaganda side, is an increasing emphasis by Islamic State core in particular on Africa, on emphasizing Africa in their propaganda, on making sure attacks in Africa get chronicled in Neba, which is their weekly news magazine. And then a few weeks ago, they even went so far as to publish an editorial calling Africa the, quote, land of migration and jihad, essentially calling for wannabe jihadists to migrate to Africa in order to wage attacks against governments there and to join Islamic State's affiliates in Africa.
Okay.
Now, it's unclear if there's been a lot of response to that. I should note the call was in Arabic, so it was probably geared towards jihadists in the Middle East and North Africa, so in Saudi or in Iraq or in Egypt, who perhaps maybe they can't go to Iraq or Syria. They could maybe more easily get to Africa or to sub-Saharan Africa in particular, given the porous border situation there. So I have to emphasize that. But there does seem to be at least a greater Islamic State desire to emphasize West Africa. In addition, there have been various messages of support from both affiliates in Iraq and Syria, Islamic State affiliates in Iraq and Syria, really encouraging the development of a jihadist architecture in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically for Islamic State.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting development, and it's definitely important to note this kind of this spike in very active, very developed propaganda related to their African affiliates. But I guess I wonder, is this a result of them just capitalizing on the victories of the Islamic State West Africa province, and it makes the broader brand look good, and so they then adopt that and push that in their propaganda because that's where they're getting victories? Or is this signaling some kind of broader strategic shift? Mm-hmm. One, which, I mean, some have argued, and I think rightfully so, that this is a strategic shift that has been in the works for years now. But to what extent do you think in this current moment, this kind of propaganda, what weight does that have? Is it just them capitalizing on victories, or is it really making this strategic push, and they're trying to do so in part through their propaganda output?
So the chain of causality is a little bit murky. Obviously, they were having some victories before they started this propaganda push, but certain attacks like the Abuja prison attack happened after they put out this push. So there's the causality is a little bit murky. So this could be a virtuous cycle from their perspective of we have initial victories, therefore we'll put out more propaganda, therefore those will encourage or lead to more victories, or it could also be this could be having some kind of at least otherwise positive morale boost. One thing I will say is that I have not seen firm evidence. There have been individual cases once in a while of foreigners going to sub-Saharan Africa for the purposes of jihad. I mean, they're fairly poorly sourced reports of a Saudi citizen gets arrested here or there,
Sure.
an individual gets arrested here or there, that kind of thing. But I have not seen, and it's probably too early to tell of are people responding to those calls right now. There's a somewhat of a division of labor propaganda-wise between the local Islamic State affiliates and the core. So the core is putting out their propaganda in Arabic or in English subtitled or in other languages, whereas the ISWAP affiliates and the other Islamic State affiliates in Africa are emphasizing or putting out their material in the local languages, really trying to recruit locally and emphasize their local bona fides and really embed within the local architecture.
Yeah, sure. And I will say, as you kind of talk about this local architecture, we just got a great question. And Charlie, can you speak to even just who all these different groups are? Are they regional or are they purely local? And I can at least speak to on the Al Qaeda side, these relationships go from top down, and then at the very bottom you do have very, very local groups. If you look at the recent attack in Mali on the Kati military base, this was claimed by a group called Katabat Messina, which is a local group that then has ties to the significantly larger JNIM, which also has ties to the regional Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and so at least on the Al Qaeda side, they've really streamlined this kind of localization strategy, and in different groups will have sort of different spheres of influence. Some at the local level, some at the broader regional level. But Charlie, can you speak to that from the Islamic State perspective?
Yeah, I can, at least to an extent. So the Islamic State strategy is a little bit more murky in this regard. So certain groups like Islamic State, Greater Sahel, kind of have a more obvious link to the broader Islamic State architecture worldwide. But and that's also to an extent true with Islamic State West Africa insofar as they've adopted the mantle more clearly. Whereas groups like Islamic State in Mozambique are much more localized and very cleaved off. And while they pledge allegiance to the Islamic State, they don't necessarily have really close, certainly not operational level ties to the broader Islamic State movement. And to an extent, that's also true of Islamic State Central Africa province in DRC and Uganda, where they're loyal to Islamic State, but they also have their own localized agenda and grievances with, in that case, the Ugandan government primarily, but also in DRC as well.
Yeah,
so,
and I would say the DRC opens up a whole nother can of worms. I mean, that's a country that has roughly 120 rebel groups. But the most notable affiliate of the Islamic State is the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces. And, and this is a question for you, Charlie, even if you happen to know, is ADF housed under Islamic State Central Africa province? Are they just at such a local level that the command and control, they're kind of autonomous in waging their own sort of war in the DRC, but also in Uganda?
Yeah, yeah. I think that it's a little of both. I think that they obviously, I think some of their capabilities have come from us, or at least they've grown their capabilities to a degree that would suggest at least some kind of Islamic State ties. That being said, I think it's, the local grievances also matter. So I would say that I would classify them for the purposes as being part of Islamic State Central Africa province, but not necessarily note that the marriage may or may not be permanent. The ties may or may not be durable over time. That's something we'll have to see as things continue. So
Sure. And I think, I mean, unfortunately, we only have 1 or 2 minutes left, but I do want to kind of scope this out and on this sort of localization, global conversation, global aspirations, because of course, Al Qaeda and the Islamic State have these global aspirations. They have these aspirations to attack the far enemy. There's always this conversation over the near enemy or the far enemy in the debates.
Yeah.
This jihadist expansion into West Africa and whatnot. Does this, because things are so local on the ground? What does this really mean for these assessments about, well, when is the Islamic State going to be able to stage a large scale attack on, say, Western targets in Western territory? And to what extent do these developments on the ground in West Africa that are often at a very local level, do they really have an impact on that assessment? Do you have any thoughts there?
So I think going forward, we're going to see one of two paths. We have the high likelihood path, and that I would say is low to moderate impact, and then we have the low likelihood but high impact scenario. And I want to touch on the low likelihood high impact scenario, and I want to touch on the low likelihood scenario first here, and that is that these groups kind of become a base of operations for Islamic State to expand to, and this would be a scenario where we see them having success in recruiting a large number of foreigners to flock to West Africa to wage jihad, and then they can launch attacks at home or go back to their home countries and launch attacks against Western targets elsewhere. I would also include in this, if we see more and more Islamic State propaganda specifically targeting the African diaspora in Europe, or especially the West African diaspora in Europe or in the United States, encouraging people in those marginalized communities, assuming they are encouraging people in those communities to go to West Africa, that would also be an indicator of global aspirations for Islamic State.
Definitely.
Especially as using West Africa as a launch pad for broader attacks against the West, particularly against in Europe, which I think is particularly vulnerable, as well as possibly even in the United States.
Yeah, I just still think though that at least from what it looks like, that would take quite a bit of time.
Yep.
And a more unified command and control, with these groups being so local, even just in their aspirations. But I'm sorry to cut you off here, Charlie. I do want to make sure we answer this one question. And this was that, are there these historical maps per se that sort of track the size of these groups, where they're active, and whatnot? And my immediate answer is yes. Now, are they updated and up to date all the time? Not necessarily. One area where we try to keep them up to date is actually within our RANE database and in our analysis. And one of the ways that we do that is tracking, these locations of these attacks, analyzing ACLED data, and then mapping them. But yes, these maps do exist, though Sometimes they may be dating as far back as 2019, especially on very specific groups. For example, Ketibet Messina, that's a little bit tougher of one to figure out where exactly geographically they are right now, where they've lost territory, where they've gained, enclaves or inroads. So that would be my answer to that. And unfortunately, we are well over time because this was a particularly fun conversation. I do want to thank everybody for tuning in, and to any of those of you who will be watching this after we're done and it's recorded, and it will be found on various platforms. But thank you for joining us. I should note one more time that RANE has an entire suite of risk and geopolitical intelligence solutions, and you can learn more at the ranenetwork.com website. So thank you very much. Thank you, Charlie. Everybody have a good Friday and a great weekend.
Yep. Have a great weekend, everybody.